The mysterious room. James Carter was an ambitious journalist, always seeking the next big story. His latest assignment brought him to a small, seemingly ordinary town named Crestwood. The town was known for its eerie legends, but one, in particular, caught his attention. The story of the mysterious room in the old Harrington mansion. The mansion, located at the edge of town, had been abandoned for decades. The locals whispered about strange occurrences, unexplained noises, and eerie lights flickering through the windows at night. But the most unsettling rumor was that a single room in the house remained locked, no matter how many times it had been forced open. Those who entered it never returned the same. Determined to uncover the truth, James reached out to the town's historian, Martha Hensley, an elderly woman with sharp eyes. She seemed reluctant to discuss the mansion. After much persuasion, she finally relented and shared its dark history. The Harringtons were a wealthy family, but their youngest son, Victor, was different, Martha said, lowering her voice. He was brilliant but obsessed with the occult. One day, he locked himself inside that room and was never seen again. His family left the house in terror, and no one dared to live there since. Intrigued, James decided to investigate. Equipped with his camera, flashlight, and notebook, he ventured into the abandoned mansion at twilight. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was thick with a sense of decay. The walls bore deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The air was filled with an acrid, moldy scent, mixed with something metallic, like dried blood. As he explored, he found the infamous door on the second floor. It was old, with deep claw-like marks scratched into its surface. He swore he could hear faint whispering beyond it. Taking a deep breath, he turned the handle. To his surprise, the door creaked open with ease. The room inside was nothing like the rest of the mansion. Unlike the dusty, neglected halls, this room was pristine. A large wooden desk stood in the center, covered in aged parchment, strange symbols, and melted candles. A massive mirror leaned against the wall, its surface unnaturally black, as if it absorbed all light. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a single, fresh set of footprints leading toward the mirror. As James stepped forward, the air grew heavy. He felt an unseen force urging him toward the mirror. Against his better judgment, he reached out and touched its surface. Instantly, the room shifted. The temperature dropped, and a whisper echoed around him. "You shouldn't have come." James spun around, his heart pounding. The door he had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. A slow, deliberate scratching sound came from inside the walls, like nails scraping against wood. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned back to the mirror. His reflection was gone, replaced by the image of a young man with hollow eyes, Victor Harrington. Victor's voice echoed in his mind. "Help me. I am trapped, but something else is here with me." James tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The mirror's surface rippled like water. A force pulled at him, dragging him forward. He struggled, but the more he resisted, the stronger the pull became. Behind him, a guttural growl filled the air, sending chills down his spine. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room. The force vanished, and James collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The mirror was now cracked, and Victor's face distorted in agony before disappearing entirely. But something moved in the darkness behind the glass, its glowing red eyes locking onto James before the crack sealed itself. Then, the whispering returned, louder this time, urgent and overlapping. The walls began to bleed, dark crimson streaks running down to the floor. The candles flickered violently before extinguishing, leaving James in complete darkness. A cold hand brushed against his neck, and a voice, raspy and ancient, spoke directly into his ear. "Run before it wakes up." A deafening screech filled the air, a sound so inhuman it made James' bones vibrate. The shadows stretched, twisting into grotesque forms with elongated fingers reaching for him. Something huge stirred within the mirror, its shape barely visible through the cracks, horned, eyeless, and grinning. The wall behind him returned to a door. Without hesitation, James stumbled out, slamming it shut behind him. The moment he did, a blood-curdling scream echoed from within, followed by frantic pounding against the door. Then silence. James never spoke of that night. He left Crestwood the next morning, abandoning his story. But deep down, he knew the truth. Victor was still in that room, waiting for someone else to open the door. And something far worse was waiting with him, watching, hungry. Years passed, and James moved far from Crestwood, trying to forget. But some nights, he would wake drenched in sweat, hearing the whispers again. The sound of nails scraping against wood. The flickering shadow of something that should not exist. Then, one night, he received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "You left the door open." Attached was a single image, his reflection in a mirror, except the face staring back wasn't his. The whispers had found him again. The resurrected corpse, in a small, fog-covered village nestled between the dark woods and an abandoned cemetery. There was an old legend whispered from generation to generation. The villagers spoke of the resurrected corpse, a tale of a man who had died and yet walked the earth once more. Chapter 1. The Death of Elias Gray. Elias Gray was a quiet, solitary man. He lived on the outskirts of the village in a decrepit house with broken windows and creaking floors. He had no family, no friends, and no one who would notice his absence if he ever disappeared. So when he died one cold winter night, barely anyone cared. His body was found 3 days later, frozen and stiff in his bed, eyes wide open as if he had seen something horrifying in his final moments. His mouth was twisted into a silent scream, and his fingernails were broken and bloody, as if he had tried to claw at something unseen. His skin was cold but strangely damp, and an unnatural stench lingered in the air. The villagers buried him quickly in the old cemetery, eager to be rid of his presence. The ground was hard from the frost, and the gravedigger muttered about how the dead should stay dead. But Elias did not stay dead. Chapter 2. The First Sightings. It began with whispers. A young boy named Thomas claimed to have seen Elias standing near the graveyard just 2 nights after his burial. The boy, pale and trembling, insisted that Elias had looked directly at him, his once lifeless eyes now glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. At first, the villagers dismissed it as childish imagination, but soon others began to report strange occurrences. A woman swore she saw Elias standing in her garden at midnight, his body contorted in an unnatural pose, his mouth moving silently as if whispering incantations. An old man said he heard footsteps outside his door, slow and dragging, only to find deep, wet footprints leading away into the darkness. Then the animals started to die. Cattle were found with their throats slit, their bodies drained of blood. Dogs howled at nothing, refusing to enter certain parts of the village. Pigs and chickens were discovered mutilated, their insides scooped out as if something had feasted upon them. And on one fateful night, a farmer's wife awoke to find Elias standing at the foot of her bed, his skeletal fingers reaching toward her, his lips mouthing words she could not hear. When she screamed, he vanished, leaving behind only a trail of rotting footprints and a suffocating stench of decay. Chapter 3. The Investigation. The village elder, Father William, decided that the matter needed to be addressed. He gathered a group of brave men, armed with torches and crosses, and led them to Elias's grave. The earth above it was undisturbed, the wooden marker still standing as it had been the day of the burial. "Perhaps it's just paranoia," one of the men murmured. Father William, however, was not convinced. "Dig up the grave," The men hesitated but obeyed. The soil was hard, but with every shovel full removed, the tension grew. Finally, they reached the coffin and pried it open. It was empty. A sudden, bone-chilling wail echoed through the cemetery, sending the men scattering in terror. Shadows moved unnaturally, creeping along the ground as if they had a mind of their own. A gust of wind blew out their torches, plunging them into darkness, and for a brief moment, they could hear something breathing heavily just beyond their sight. Then came the laughter, a rasping, broken sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Chapter 4, The Hunt. Panic consumed the village. If Elias was not in his grave, then where was he? That very night, more sightings occurred. A shepherd found his flock slaughtered, the corpses twisted and torn, their eyes missing. A merchant cart was overturned in the road, claw marks gouged into the wood, and an eerie whispering could be heard when one stood near it. Then came the first attack. A man named Henry was found outside his home, his face frozen in terror, his throat torn open. His body was positioned strangely, as if he had been crawling away from something unseen before he died. The villagers were horrified. This was no mere ghost. This was something worse. Something real. Something hungry. That night, the village was plagued by scratching sounds against doors and windows. Some claimed they saw skeletal fingers reaching through the cracks, and others heard a distorted voice calling their names from the darkness. The sound of a child's laughter echoed through the empty streets, only for the villagers to realize that no children had been outside. When dawn arrived, a trail of blood led from the village square to the cemetery, where the wooden cross marking Elias's grave had been snapped in half. Father William knew they had no choice. They had to find Elias and put an end to him once and for all. Chapter 5, The Confrontation. Torches in hand, the villagers searched the woods surrounding the graveyard. The night was thick with mist, and every shadow seemed to move. Then they heard it, the sound of something dragging itself through the underbrush. A figure stepped into the firelight. It was Elias. His skin was ashen, stretched too tightly over his bones. His fingers ended in jagged, broken nails, and his eyes. Oh, his eyes, burned with an unnatural hollow hunger. A black ichor dripped from his mouth, sizzling as it touched the ground. His limbs moved stiffly at first, but then, with a grotesque snap, his head twisted unnaturally, fixing his gaze upon the villagers. Elias let out a sickening gurgle, and from his open mouth, a swarm of writhing black insects poured forth, scattering into the night. The villagers recoiled in horror, their screams drowned by a deafening screech that seemed to tear through the air itself. The ground beneath them trembled as shadows slithered and pulsed, forming twisted figures that clawed at their feet. Father William raised his cross and spoke a prayer louder than the screams. Elias shrieked, his body convulsing, smoke rising from his skin as if burned by an invisible fire. His shrieks were deafening, a cacophony of agony that rang through the night. His skin bubbled, split open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Elias reached out with one final, grasping hand, his fingers lengthening unnaturally, stretching toward the villagers. With a final, piercing wail, Elias collapsed, his body crumbling into dust before their very eyes. The wind carried the remnants of his form away, and the silence that followed was deafening. Chapter 6, The Aftermath. The village never spoke of Elias Gray again. His house was burned to the ground, his name erased from records. But the fear remained. The legend of the resurrected corpse lived on, and every winter, when the wind howled through the trees, the villagers would lock their doors a little tighter and whisper prayers a little louder, just in case Elias ever decided to rise again. Because some things, once awakened, never truly sleep. And deep in the frozen earth, beneath the charred ruins of his home, something stirred. A faint, ragged breath. Then silence. The Strange Child. Chapter 1. the mysterious birth. In a small, mist-covered village nestled deep in the mountains, a child unlike any other was born on the night of the blood moon. The villagers, known for their superstitions, whispered among themselves as an eerie silence filled the air. The cries of a newborn were not like those of an ordinary baby. They carried an unnatural resonance, echoing through the hills like the call of a forgotten spirit. Marina, the mother, trembled as she held her child for the first time. The baby's skin was pale, almost translucent, and its large, dark eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dim candlelight. The midwife gasped, muttering prayers under her breath before quickly retreating from the room. The news spread like wildfire. "A cursed child," the elders muttered, "an omen of misfortune." But Marina refused to abandon her baby. She named him Elias, vowing to protect him from the villagers' scorn. Little did she know, her son's presence would soon unravel dark secrets hidden within the village for centuries. That very night, strange occurrences began. Doors creaked open and slammed shut on their own. The wind howled with voices that sounded too human to be natural, and shadows moved in ways that defied logic. Marina swore she saw skeletal hands crawling from beneath her bed, reaching for her as she clutched her newborn son tighter. Blood dripped from the ceiling, forming ominous symbols that vanished the moment she screamed. Chapter 2. A child unlike any other. Elias grew up under the wary gazes of the villagers. Though Marina tried to raise him like any normal child, it became evident that Elias was far from ordinary. He rarely cried, and when he did, strange things happened. Candles flickered violently, the wind howled through closed windows, and sometimes the earth itself seemed to tremble. By the age of 5, he could see things others couldn't. Shadows moved when there was no light. Whispers filled the air even when no one spoke. He spoke to unseen entities, answering voices that only he could hear. "Who are you talking to, Elias?" Marina asked one evening as she caught him staring at the corner of the room. "The old man in the cloak," Elias replied matter-of-factly. "He says the village is built on a graveyard of forgotten souls." Marina shivered. No one had ever told Elias such things, yet his words bore an unsettling truth. That night, she awoke to the sound of laughter, high-pitched, echoing laughter that was not Elias's. A shadow loomed over his crib, its twisted form dripping with black ichor, its hollow eyes staring into hers before vanishing into the darkness. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing like the inside of a living creature. She decided to keep him inside as much as possible, fearing what the villagers would do if they found out the extent of his strange abilities. Chapter 3. The Fear of the Village. As Elias grew older, the villagers' fear of him intensified. Animals refused to go near him. Crops withered when he walked past, and nightmares plagued those who met his gaze for too long. One day, a group of boys decided to test their courage. They cornered Elias in the woods, taunting him. "Monster! Cursed child!" they sneered. Elias remained silent, his dark eyes studying them. Then, without warning, a gust of wind howled through the trees. The sky darkened, and the boys felt an invisible force gripping their throats. Panic filled their eyes as they gasped for air. "Stop!" one of them managed to croak. Elias blinked, and just as suddenly as it began, the force released them. The boys ran, screaming about the devil's child. That night, the village square was drenched in blood. Livestock had been found torn open, their insides arranged in strange patterns. The church bell tolled without a hand to ring it. Something ancient and malevolent had stirred. The well water turned black, thick as tar, and those who drank from it found worms crawling from their mouths. The incident solidified the villagers' decision. Elias was dangerous. Something had to be done. Chapter 4. The Hunt. A town meeting was called. The elders declared that Elias was a danger to everyone. He must be cast out or destroyed, they declared. Marina pleaded for mercy. But fear had turned the villagers into a mob. That night, as torches blazed and angry voices filled the air, Marina made a decision. She took Elias and fled into the dark forest, hoping to escape the fate the villagers had decided for him. But the forest held its own horrors. Strange eyes glowed in the darkness, and whispers taunted them from the trees. As they ran, Marina felt an invisible force guiding them deeper into the unknown. Roots seemed to writhe and twist under their feet, forming shapes of screaming faces, their silent agony echoing in her mind. They stumbled upon an ancient ruin, one that had not been touched by time. Symbols like those Elias often drew in the dirt covered the stone walls. In the center of the ruins stood a figure draped in shadows. "Welcome home, child," the figure said in a voice that sent chills through Marina's spine. Elias, however, simply smiled. "I've been waiting." Chapter 5, The Reckoning. The figure introduced himself as Orin, the guardian of the Forgotten Ones. He revealed the truth about Elias. He was not merely human. He was the reincarnation of an ancient entity, a bridge between the living and the dead. "You were born to awaken the balance," Orin explained. "The village was built on the suffering of those who were wronged. You have the power to set them free." Elias listened intently, as if he had always known this truth deep within his soul. Marina, though fearful, realized that she could not change who her son was meant to be. That night, the village suffered its final horror. The earth split open, and skeletal hands burst from beneath the cobblestones. The spirits of the wronged emerged, their faces contorted in agony. The villagers tried to run, but the darkness swallowed them whole. Flesh melted from their bones, their screams blending with the wails of the restless dead. By morning, the village was nothing more than an abandoned ruin. The few who survived were left insane, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. Marina and Elias stood atop the highest hill, watching the destruction unfold. "It is done," Orin whispered. Elias turned to his mother, his black eyes reflecting the crimson dawn. "We must go now." And with that, they vanished into the mist, leaving behind only echoes of laughter and the lingering whispers of the forgotten. Epilogue: The Cursed Land. Years passed, and the village was erased from maps, its name lost to time. Travelers who dared to venture near the ruins spoke of voices in the wind, of shadows that slithered against the ground. Some claimed to see a child with pale skin and black eyes watching from the trees, whispering in a language not meant for the living. Elias's story was no longer a mere legend. It was a warning, a tale of vengeance, of reckoning, and of the horrors that come when the past refuses to stay buried. For even now, on nights when the blood moon rises, those who listen closely can still hear the cries of the doomed, forever trapped in the embrace of the forgotten.